Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. Last episode, we examined the history of the so-called Garamantian classical period, an era associated with the most complex and prosperous stage of Garamantian history. During the classical period, the Garamantian kingdom produced a standard of living on par, if not higher, than most other urban civilizations of its time, and became the most complex and urbanized society yet seen in the Sahara. However, the history of humanity showcases well that good times can never last forever, and so the Garamantes will prove to be no exception. Join us as we examine the evidence and speculate on what may have caused the eventual downfall of the Garamantes civilization. Season 5, Episode 6, The Mysterious Garamantian Collapse. By the 3rd century AD, if you were living in the Garamantian kingdom, it would be hard to sell people on the idea that their society and civilization was just a few centuries away from disappearing. Following one final war with Rome during the reign of Septimius Severus, the following centuries would be peaceful between the Garamantes and their most powerful and also dangerous neighbor. The economy of Garama was flourishing, with new buildings being erected frequently, and the population perpetually seeming to grow. The Garamantian architecture had grown increasingly advanced, with small packed mud homes being abandoned for far more elaborate mud brick and sandstone ashlar complexes. By the 3rd century, life expectancy in Garama had exceeded the late 30s, which is thoroughly unimpressive by today's standards, but actually surpassed most of their ancient contemporaries, including the Romans to their north, though I should note that in both cases, this figure is skewed quite low due to high infant and childhood mortality, and that for a typical person who lived into adulthood, lifespans in the 50s and 60s were not at all uncommon. The hydrological infrastructure of Garama was also among the biggest and most advanced on Earth, and now that peace with Rome was established for the long haul, caravans carrying trade goods to and from North Africa were more common across the Sahara than ever before. Trade was booming so thoroughly that by the classical period, the old system of bartering that the Garamantes had relied on for centuries proved insufficient, and eventually the Garamantes even implemented something of a monetary system, using colorful beads as their currency. The future must have seemed bright, and the idea that the society was approaching the end of its best days, entirely unthinkable. And that opens the door to the question of what exactly happened. We know from archaeological records that the Garamantian state as we know it from the classical period would entirely fade out of existence in just a few centuries. What could have possibly gone so wrong to cause such a grand catastrophe? If you looked for an answer to this question in the form of pop history articles, their authors would claim that it is not a deep or interesting question at all. In fact, according to these articles, the cause of the Garamantian civilization is super easy to find. It all came down to water. The Garamantes, this narrative goes, possessed a finite resource of groundwater from earlier periods. As the centuries went on and the population grew, the Saharan groundwater reserves that the Garamantian Fugara systems relied on eventually became tapped dry. And so, the Garamantian civilization perished from thirst and drought. This historical narrative is then woven as an environmental cautionary tale. If we fail to manage our resources properly, then our civilization too will go the way of the Garamantes. The journalist Peter Beaumont of The Guardian once summarized this hypothesis in a beautifully succinct manner. So, what happened to the Garamantes? In the end, like the Easter Islanders, the Anasazi, the Greenland Norse, or the Maya, it appears that the Garamantes outgrew their ability to exploit the environment around them. In the 6 centuries that they thrived, the Garamantes extracted, it is estimated, in the region of 30 billion gallons of water through the Fugara system of subterranean tunnels. They reached what might be called a peak water moment. When they had passed peak water, the Garamantes, the very great nation, were doomed to decline. As you may have noticed from the very start of that article, the Garamantes in this narrative are posited as far from an isolated example, but simply one of many instances of ancient civilizations causing their own collapse through environmental mismanagement. Like the other civilizations mentioned, the Garamantes, starting really in the 60s and 70s, started to be used alongside other ancient civilizations like Easter Island or the Maya as environmental cautionary tales. However, while this narrative is widespread among pop historians and journalists, it's not a narrative that I can entirely place at their feet. Highly respectable and capable academics have also at times backed this idea. While I normally prefer not to name and shame, there is one example of this that so perfectly summarizes this narrative of Garamantian history as a cautionary tale that I just can't help but read directly from it. This is a presentation called Living in Extreme Environments, Hydrologic Serendipity, and the Garamantian Empire of the Sahara Desert. The presentation was given by 3 genuinely renowned and brilliant scholars of earth and environmental sciences. To quote directly from their presentation summary, the Garamantes constructed an impressive 750 kilometers of these underground tunnels and access shafts between 100 BCE and 100 CE, defying the odds of a lack of annual water recharge. However, the Garamantes' fortune turned when ground-level waters dropped below the Foggara tunnels. This historical example is a cautionary tale, highlighting the vulnerability of relying on groundwater resources in extreme environments. As the world witnesses the rise of more extreme conditions in places like Iran and the unsustainable use of groundwater, the story of the Garamantian Empire underscores the importance of responsible water management and the consequences of overexploiting this vital resource. Yeah, couldn't have summed up this narrative better myself. Now, as you can probably already tell by the way I'm talking about it, I think that this is a flawed view. I disagree with it, and I think it is excessively simplistic, and we will go into that pretty extensively in just a moment. Just like many others have done regarding the more frequently cited examples of environmental cautionary tales, like the Maya or Easter Island civilizations, I believe that this narrative takes a complex and still quite mysterious historical process and simplifies it excessively to the point of being somewhat misleading, merely for the sake of creating a clean environmental fable out of an incomplete reading of history. However, before we continue, I want to make it clear that my issues here are not at all with the credibility of the authors of that presentation within their own field, nor do I take any issue with the conclusions that they reach regarding present-day issues of water use. In the presentation, they call attention to very real and deathly serious shortcomings of contemporary water policy. I highly recommend that you check out the presentation if you are interested in that kind of thing, which is freely available online, and that you do not interpret this podcast as some sort of refutation or denunciation on any of their inclusions about that matter. Rather, it is just a critique of some of the nuances of how Garamantian history is depicted as, within the article's own words, a cautionary tale about groundwater use. In general, I am someone who is quite skeptical of any historical narrative which frames history as a fable, especially a fable which is so clearly used to bolster a specific contemporary argument. These narratives tend to selectively rely on elements of historical evidence that can support their fable-like interpretation, and ignore historical evidence that contradicts it. So, before we get into the potential causes of the Garamantian civilizational collapse, we need to take a closer look at the archaeological evidence that such a collapse even happened. The main piece of archaeological evidence for the existence of a centralized Garamantian kingdom is the sheer scale of their ancient irrigation infrastructure. The foggaras that the Garamantes used to harvest fossil water from the Sahara groundwater reservoirs are large enough and complex enough that they strongly indicate the need to be maintained by a massive and consistent pool of labor. A pool of labor that only the control of a centralized state can provide. And since the existence of the foggaras are the main piece of evidence for the existence of such a state, it follows that their disappearance would be our first major sign of social collapse in the Fezzan. Around the beginning of the 4th century AD, the construction of new foggaras and the maintenance of the old ones begins to trickle out, before, by the end of the century, it had suddenly ceased altogether. Something had happened in this time that brought the long-established practice of foggara building to an abrupt conclusion. And perhaps we can find a hint to the cause of this decline in an analysis of the region's archaeobotanical landscape. By the classical Garamantian period, the number of plants that were cultivated on farms in the Wadi al-Ajal had reached the peak of their biodiversity. Alongside the typical staple crops of Egyptian wheat, West African sorghum, and the locally popular date palms, the classical period featured a rise in the cultivation of imported exotic plants. Mediterranean staples such as grapes, pomegranates, olives, safflower, melons, and cotton became widely cultivated during the classical period. It went from obscure rare crops to being widely cultivated during this period, while some crops, like flaxseed and almonds, don't appear in the archaeological record at all in Garama until the very end of the classical period. But just as new crops are being introduced into Garamantian fields by the end of the classical period, other crops were vanishing at a similar rate. Sorghum disappeared entirely, while pearl millet transformed from a widely cultivated staple to a relative rarity. The seeming replacement of sorghum and millet with other crops concerns us for their effect on the Garamantian hydraulic economy. It's worth noting that the West African sorghum and pearl millet species that vanished during this period were renowned for their drought resistance and low water consumption per calorie. To this day, these crops are widely cherished among farmers in areas with frequent droughts. It's equally notable that the crops which the Garamantes were increasingly cultivating in expanding volumes were largely water inefficient. The single best example of this is, of course, cotton, being among the most perpetually thirsty crops widely cultivated in the world. So, during the late classical Garamantian period, it seems like as a whole there was a trend of replacing drought-resistant crops with more water-intensive ones. And this shift in cultivation is a strange one. After all, if the Fogaras were rapidly drying up during this period as widely claimed, it appears that the Garamantes themselves were entirely unaware of this or simply didn't care, electing to grow crops that would have exacerbated the problem of water consumption even further. Now, at first glance, that might seem to align well with the hydraulic collapse model. After all, it totally makes sense that the Garamantians, in their hubris, continued to cultivate riskier and higher water need crops, thinking that their underground reservoirs would never run dry, and ultimately ended up only accelerating their civilization's demise. Only after the Fogaras ran dry would the Garamantes have had the chance to recognize the error of their ways. It's a compelling story, but it has a major problem. This is the important part. These water-hungry new crops continue to be cultivated even long after the end of the Garamantian period. Immediately after, and for hundreds of years after the supposed hydraulic apocalypse which wrecked the Garamantian state, these water-hungry crops remain staples of Garamantian fields. I can maybe get behind the idea that the Garamantes were slow to recognize their dwindling water reserves before it was too late, but the presence of such water-hungry crops for hundreds of years after the Garamantes' so-called peak water moment is more than enough to cast some doubt on this idea. Perhaps an even more crucial piece of evidence that casts a shadow of skepticism on the hydrocentric narrative is the suddenness of the seeming abandonment of the Fogaras. After all, if the water in the Fogaras was beginning to trickle to a halt, appearing only in lower and lower parts of the tunnel, you'd expect that the very first thing the Garamantes would do is to desperately try and expand the systems to bring back the flow. And just like you would expect, there are a few such examples. Near the town of Tawash, a settlement northwest of Garama itself, the nearby Fogaras show the evidence of the last major renovation of these systems, with the tunnels reaching deeper into the earth and branching out into a greater number of tributaries to channel in higher levels of groundwater. However, Tawash is notable because of its rarity. And to top it all off, the vast majority of Fogaras did not actually reach the bottom of the Fezan reservoir, or even come close. The main water table that the Garamantes relied on was composed of fair quality water accumulated from about 20 million years ago, and it is still around and widely used today, despite its water levels recovering at a snail's pace. To summarize, there was still plenty of water left. A return to functionality for the Fogaras was a simple series of renovations away, and given that the Garamantes had been the same people who had built these impressive tunnels to begin with, they clearly had the ability to do it again. Or did they? Yes, a functioning, stable Garamantian kingdom could have fixed the Fogaras. However, there is plenty of evidence that indicates that the Garamantes of the 4th century were anything but stable. See, the real root cause of the Garamantian collapse was not a shortage of water, but a set of economic and social problems that had been affecting the Garamantian state since even before the water problems became apparent. The first sign that everything was not so good in Garama, even before the turn of the 3rd century, is the sudden reemergence of defensive structures in the Wadi al-Jal. One theme that had remained a constant of earlier periods of Garamantian history was the general movement away from an emphasis on defensive settlements. Since the earliest settlements on the rocky escarpments of Zinkekra, the centers of population in the Garamantian kingdom had gradually shifted away from defensible hilltops towards more vulnerable and largely undefended settlements in the valley. The few defensive structures that remained in use during the classical period were located overwhelmingly on the northern frontier, in order to maintain control over northern nomads or defend against Roman incursions. However, around the later years of the 3rd century, this started to change. The forts along the northern frontier were gradually abandoned, and in their place, a new type of fortification arose. Known as the Gsur, these were fortified, almost castle-like structures. But despite their overtly militaristic appearance, Gsur were not stationed with soldiers or armories, but were instead simple farmhouses. Farmhouses which just so happened to be built like fortresses. The Gsur were like the ancient Saharan equivalent of a house with bunker-like concrete walls, a barbed wire fence on the front yard, and a door reinforced with several deadbolts. Now imagine how you would react if all of your neighbors who could afford to do so suddenly started building their houses of reinforced concrete and barbed wire. That's probably not a sign of a healthy, safe, or stable community. Much like how the rise of bunker-like homes today is often an indication of worsening conditions in a given neighborhood, so too is the rise of castle-like farmsteads in the Wadi al-Jal in the 4th century, a signpost that the Garamantian society was becoming increasingly unstable even before the water shortages had begun. Now, the exact cause of this decline in stability and safety in Garama is entirely unclear. But one ongoing problem we're aware of that may have played a role was an apparent economic decline also occurring at the same time in the late 3rd and early 4th century, not just in the Wadi al-Jal, but across much of North Africa. See, North Africa had been undergoing a state of prolonged economic malaise throughout this time. The Roman Empire of this period was entering a state of near-permanent crisis, and North Africa was along for the ride. The region, which had economically relied on grain cultivation and exportation, suffered heavily as trade routes between North Africa and Italy became less frequent, more unreliable, and more vulnerable to piracy. Consequently, the decline of the economy of northern Africa affected the Garamantes as well, with Roman imports dramatically declining in number in the early 4th century. But perhaps the most important effect that linked the Roman economy to Garama was the trans-Saharan trade in enslaved workers. For some context, the trans-Saharan slave trade throughout most of Roman history had likely been no bigger than a blip in their economy of slavery. Roman wars of expansion and the crushing of revolts had always provided a sizable cushion of prisoners of war and captured civilians who could be exploited in fields, mines, and cities. But as the empire experienced crisis after crisis, these foreign wars became less lucrative and less frequent. The supply of enslaved workers declined steadily, and while, yes, demand fell as well, the supply dwindled much more quickly, and prices skyrocketed. A few scholars have postulated that this shift in the Roman economy may have been the true root cause of the Garamantian collapse. With the rising price of enslaved workers, Garamantian merchants may have prioritized the short-term profits from exporting enslaved workers over the long-term profit of exploiting enslaved workers to build and maintain fulgaras. In this hypothesis, the over-exportation of enslaved workers caused a severe labor shortage in the Garamantian kingdom, and by the time that the Garamantes realized what was happening, it was too late, and the failing agricultural sector sent Garama into an economic death spiral. The denizens of the city, increasingly restless over their declining living standards, rose up, eventually leading to their abandonment. But while interesting, the hyper-exportation hypothesis does overlook a few key details. It doesn't make sense that in an era of supposedly high slave trafficking, that the archaeological data would indicate that trade between Roman North Africa and Garama was falling as a whole. Alternatively, perhaps it was this exact lack of trade that led to a labor shortage. With fewer Roman goods to exchange, the Garamantes may have had fewer resources to acquire enslaved workers through trade. causing a sudden crisis of labor that led to the abandonment of the Fulgaras. Now, I do agree with certain elements of the labor crisis hypothesis of the Garamantian collapse. For example, I think that the lack of desperate renovations, save for a few key sites, does support the idea that the Garamantes knew about the declining reservoir levels, knew how to restore the irrigation system of their country, but simply didn't possess the resources or labor at their disposal to do anything about it. But while I wish I could conclude this show by giving you a straightforward and confident answer on what exactly caused the Garamantian collapse, the reality is that there is no clear-cut answer to exactly what happened. Even beyond the ideas we explored here, there are many other interesting speculations to discuss. For example, Garamantian civilization had always consisted of two parallel societies, settled urban farming communities and rural nomadic pastoralists. Perhaps it was not over-exportation or Roman economic woes which caused a collapse in trans-Saharan trade, but rather declining Garamantian control over their nomadic neighbors. Perhaps that is why the defensive structures of the period crept away from the frontiers and into the urban centers. The frontiers had collapsed as the Garamantes lost control of the nomads. Or perhaps the true catalyst for the Garamantian collapse was an internal revolt. What if the crisis of labor was caused by enslaved workers having enough and rising up against their exploiters in growing numbers, while those who could afford to do so retreated to ever more fortress-like homes? Or perhaps it was even linked to natural climate change. After all, the Sahara has only grown hotter, drier, and less hospitable since the birth of a Garamantian civilization. Perhaps it was the stress of an increasingly hostile climate that accelerated these otherwise manageable problems into a true crisis. Perhaps. You might have noticed a pattern here. Sadly, just as much of our understanding of Garamantian history, culture, politics, and daily life is left up to educated speculation, so too is their collapse. I hate to disappoint all of you listening to the show, but this is the reality of studying the ancient past, especially the past of a region that lacks long-form written histories to criticize, and was largely neglected by the world of modern historical and archaeological scholarship until relatively recently. I think it's telling that during my research for the show, the vast majority of scholarly studies of the Garamantes are forced to simply shrug their shoulders when it comes to closing out the wonderful epic of these ancient people who made the desert bloom. I find it equally fitting that certain online publications are willing to do the opposite, simplify this complex web of unanswered questions into a straightforward and easily digested fable. With a topic this mysterious, the sad truth is that anyone claiming to have a straightforward and obvious answer is simply lying to put a neat bow on this story full of question marks from start to finish. That is, unless the problem wasn't any of these hypotheses at all. What if our true root problem is with the very notion of Garamantian collapse itself? What if the very question, why did the Garamantes collapse, is already a farce, a leading question to a false conclusion? Sure, the Fulgaras may have gone dry in the 4th century, but as we discussed at the very start of this episode, the cultivation, even of water-intensive crops, continued long after the supposed apocalyptic collapse of the Garamantes. And while your brain may have been projecting a mental image of a post-apocalyptic Saharan wasteland, a place destroyed by internal conflicts and collapse, the reality of what followed the Garamantes couldn't be more different. While nearby Fulgaras were abandoned, the city of Garama itself and many other settlements were not. No, something else might have been happening. What if we've been thinking about this all wrong? That the tale of Garamantes does not end with civilizational death, but instead is a story of adaptation. Join us for our next episode and the finale of our 5th season, as we examine what exactly happened to the people of the Garamantes after their supposed civilizational collapse, and ask ourselves if the Garamantian civilization truly even ended in ancient times, or if this supposed cultural apocalypse was actually just an ordinary political metamorphosis. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Ayo Fagbamie, Dimitri, Alexander Travis, BB Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Johnny Knowles, Godfrey Sibilabie, Pascal Mwokocha, Joe Maxwell, Nkechi Nwabadike, Sheyu Nolorontimain, Kwaju Amankwa, Douglas Harder and Sherry Robinson, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badeau, Ghassan Firjiani, Nee T, Kitty, Tariq Beetleman, Kelvin J. Norris, Ellen Fisher, Afrocentric Beauty, and Jessica, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really, 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 really means a lot.